Hello, I do hope you are able to sleep peacefully and restfully tonight. Tonight's story to put you to bed is called Rainbow's End by Irene Hennon. Let us begin. The little boy was watching her. Startled, Jill Whalen froze. She had no idea how long her young visitor had been crouched in the shadows of the large boulders that separated her sunny meadow from the dark woods beyond, but she sensed that he'd been there quite a while. If he hadn't shifted position to keep her in sight as she moved across the field, she doubted whether his presence would ever have registered in her peripheral vision. Now that it had, however, the tense lines of his body warned her that he was poised to run at the slightest hint of detection. Instead of making eye contact, she resumed gathering wildflowers, salvaging as many of the profuse July blooms as her large basket would hold before the angry clouds sweeping across the sea battered the islands with a flattening torrent of rain and wind. So far, she had gone about her task with the same singular focus and intensity she brought to her pointing, which also explained why the solemn-eyed, brown-haired little boy hadn't caught her attention before. Now she was acutely conscious of his scrutiny. As she bent, reached, and clipped, savoring the vivid colors of the perfect blossoms, he continued to stare. That didn't surprise her. She was used to people gawking. She was also used to people keeping their distance. Her appearance made adults uncomfortable and, on a couple of occasions, had even frightened the small children. This little boy, however, seemed more cautious than scared, as if he wanted to communicate with her. Yet something was holding him back. And for once she didn't think it was the disfiguring scars that covered most of the right side of her face. But then, what did she know? After 2 years of self-imposed isolation on this outcrop of the rock in San Juan Islands off the coast of Washington State, her once keen people skills were rusty at best. Still, she knew all about loneliness, and she could feel it emanating from the little boy in an almost tangible way that tugged at her heart. With slow, deliberate breaths, she eased closer to him. Out of the corner of her eye, she noted the grimy, oversized t-shirt that hung on his thin frame. His unkempt hair didn't look as if it had been seen a comb in weeks, and a large smudge of dirt on his face obscured the sprinkling of freckles that spilled across the bridge of his nose and onto his cheeks. He was about 6, maybe 7, she estimated. Odd that she'd never seen him before. The adjacent property, which abutted Morin State Park on the less populated eastern wing of butterfly-shaped Ocris Island, had never shown any sign of habitation, unless, of course, you counted the occasional black-tailed deer that wandered onto her property to see if she had replaced any of her deer-resistant plants with something more suited to their tastes, or the raccoons that came to forage in her trash bin. But Marilyn, at the tiny grocery store a few miles down the road, had mentioned once that an old hermit lived there. If so, he had earned that label because Jill had never seen any evidence of his existence. So who was the little boy? Could he be lost? Hungry? Injured? Did he need help? Her nurturing instincts kicked in, and she set the basket on the ground, then slid her clippers into the back pocket of her jeans. After dropping to one knee, she adjusted the brim of her hat to better shade her face, then turned toward the boy. His eyes, blue as a summer sky, widened in alarm when they met hers. For a second he froze, much like the deer she often started on her twilight walks to the shore, a quarter of a mile away. Then he half rose from his crouched stance, prepared to run. When Jin remained motionless, however, he held his position and stared back at her. Hello there, my name is Jill. What's yours? Sometimes the husky quality of her once soprano voice still surprised her, especially after she hadn't used it for a few days. It occurred to her as she spoke that she hadn't had any contact with another human being since her once-a-month shopping trip into East Sound to stock up on essentials, and that had been how long ago now? 5 days, maybe. Instead of responding, the boy stood and, with one more fearful glance in her direction, took off at a run into the deep woods behind him, where the shadows of the firs and cedars quickly swallowed him up. Sighing, Jill reached for her basket and rose. It seemed the skittish little boy didn't need her, after all. Perhaps he had just been shocked and curious about her appearance. It wouldn't be the first time she had drawn that kind of unwelcome attention, nor, unfortunately, would it be the last. The lashing rain slammed against the windshield of Keith Michael's older model compact car with enough force to render the wipes almost useless, despite their valiant effort to keep up. And the waves pounding the jagged shore just a few feet below the narrow, dark road did nothing to ease the tension in his shoulders. With each mile that passed, he was sorrier that he hadn't thought ahead and realized how difficult it would be to find a place to stay over the 4th of July weekend. Except the imminent holiday hadn't even registered in his consciousness. For the past year, the days and weeks had blended together in one long gray blur. Weary now after months on the road, he'd hoped that San Juan Islands would offer him a quiet, out-of-the-way spot in which to figure out what he was going to do with the rest of his life. Well, Orcas Island might be about as far away from Ohio as he could get in the contiguous, none or less, 48 states. But this remote speak of island was way more populous than he had expected. When he had seen the congestion in tiny Arcos village as he had driven off the ferry, he had been tempted to turn around and get back on. Except his hand had been the last boat of the day. meaning he was stuck here overnight. And now he was driving the back roads in what could very well turn out to be a wild goose chase. Still, it was his best hope of finding a place to sleep tonight. He wasn't about to try and set up his tent in this torrential downpour. And every single inn and bed and breakfast he had passed had displayed no vacancy signs. Considering the pricey tabs and the sad state of his finances, he supposed that was a blessing in disguise. In any case, a garrulous checker at the grocery store in East Sound, where he had stopped to buy a deli sandwich, had picked up on his plight in no time. She suggested that a widow lady she knew of might be willing to give him the use of a small cottage on her property for one night. I live down her way, and I try to chat with her a bit when she comes in every few weeks, the woman explained. She doesn't rent the cottage out as a rule and mostly keeps to herself, but I expect she might give you shelter from the storm that's brewing. She's always taking in stray critters. The woman had laughed and planted her hands on her ample hips. She's got an account here, so we have her number. Shall I give her a call? A widow lady who took in strays. She was probably one of those eccentric old women who had 40 cats on the property and kept newspapers from 10 years ago piled up in a spare room, Keith mused. What choice did he have? Sure, why not? He responded. Hey, Beth, cover for me a minute, will you? I need to call out to the Whalen place. A perky young woman with long blonde hair, wearing a cropped shirt that skimmed the waistband of her low-cut jeans, came up behind the woman. Sure thing. She gave Keith a smile that could be just friendly or inviting. He didn't trust himself to make that judgment anymore, but he figured it must be the former. After all, he hadn't shaved in several days. His own jeans were threadbare and faded, and his black leather jacket was scuffed and worn. He didn't see how any woman could find him attractive. Then again, considering the current Hollywood heartthrobs, maybe the dangerous, bad boy image was a turn-on. Best not to take chances. He stepped back and turned away to stare out of the store's plate glass window. Large drops of rain were already darkening the pavement, and lightning slashed across the sky, branding an angry streak onto the inky blackness and outlining the looming profile of a nearby mountain. The mood could only be described as ominous and depressing, which somehow seemed fitting for this last stop on his year-long journey. A journey he'd hoped would lead him to answers, to healing, to resolution, even back to God. Instead, he felt just as lost, just as empty, just as broken as he had 12 months before when he had set out on his quest. All he had to show for his travels was a bunch of photographs stuffed in a box in the back of his car. At first, he had snapped dozens of images a week, but as the months had worn on, he had taken fewer and fewer pictures. He stopped developing even those 3 months ago. The film from his recent efforts was still wound in tight coils, hidden inside a handful of dark spools he tossed into an empty fast food bag. Where did he go from here? He wondered. The answer was elusive, and despair swamped him, much as a sudden torrent of rain was flooding the streets. He reached the end of the line. Literally, there was nowhere else to turn. Looks like the phone's out over at the Whalen's place. The older woman's voice intruded on his thoughts, and he turned, grateful for the interruption that gave him an excuse to delay the tough questions for another day. But you could ride on out there. She'll come. How far is it? 12, 14 miles. His spirit took another dive. The last thing he wanted to do was drive more than a dozen miles in this storm. You're sure there's nothing closer? Sorry, every place is full. A lot of the mainlanders come for the 4th, make their reservations months ahead. There's not a campsite or room to be had anywhere this weekend on the San Juan Islands. You can trust me on that. He didn't need to trust her. He'd seen the no vacancy sign himself. You suppose he should be grateful the woman had come up with the widow lady's cottage. Except gratitude wasn't something that came easily to him anymore, or at all. Okay, thanks. He dredged up the words from somewhere. Can you tell me how to get there? A few minutes later, his sandwich in one hand and scribbled directions in the other, he stepped into the rain and dashed for his car. Now, after 30 minutes of snail-paced, white-knuckle driving, he figured he must be getting close. Although his stomach was numbing. His sandwich lay uneaten on the seat beside him. Navigating the pitch-dark road required his full attention, more so as he approached his destination, when the pavement narrowed and the center line disappeared. The woman at the store had said to watch for the blue mailbox with a sign underneath that said Rainbow's End. Up to this point, he'd seen very few mailboxes, and none that matched the woman's description. Of course, he might have missed it. His headlights could barely illuminate the desert road, let alone pick out the occasional side road that branched off. And he wasn't about to retrace his steps. Worst case, he'd ease onto the shoulder, if he could find one, recline his seat, and catch what sleep he could right there. In some ways, that might be preferable to staying in some hermit's cottage. Anyway, in fact, the more he thought about it, the more appealing. All at once, a small deer darted in front of the car, no more than a flash across his headlights. Shocked, Keith slammed on the brakes and yanked the wheel to the left, skidding to a stop at the edge of the pavement, mere inches above the flooded ravine that ran alongside the road. As he stared at the turbulent dark water, waiting for the pounding of his heart to subside, he drew a shaky breath. Talk about close calls. He might not be all that excited about life anymore, but he sure didn't want his to end in a drainage ditch. When at last his pulse slowed and he raised his head, his eyes widened in surprise. A few feet in front of him was a washed-out blue mailbox and a chipped peeling sign. Though the letters were faded, the words were discernible. Rainbow's End. If his headlights hadn't been angled in this exact direction, he'd have missed it. Once upon a time, Keith would have attributed such a coincidence to Providence. Now, he just considered it good luck. Or perhaps bad, depending on what he found at the end of the rutted gravel lanes beside the mailbox, he amended. But he was bone weary, and at least the steep, tiny by-the-way that wound up into the woods held out the hope of shelter from the storm. At this point, he didn't even care about eccentric widows, stray cats, or old newspapers. All he cared about was a protected place to wait out the storm. He just hoped it was drive. At first, Jill didn't notice the thumping sound that blended in with the unremitting rumble of the thunder. But when thumping turned to pounding, she realized that there was a person on the other side of her front door. An impatient person, if the increasingly aggressive banging was any indication. Considering her scarcity of visitors, Jill could only stare at the door, dumbfounded. Madeline from the art gallery had stopped by 2 weeks before, but no one had set foot on her property since. Unless you counted the little boy earlier today, but he hardly qualified as a visitor, considering he had stayed on the perimeter of her land and avoided contact. Unlike the person on the other side of her door, who was making it clear that contact was his or her presence. Precise intent. Another crash of thunder boomed through the dark house, and Jill jerked, sending a beam from the flashlight in her hand bouncing off the opposite wall. Without electricity, the warm, comforting home she had created was dim and shadowy. She had put a battery-operated torch on the kitchen table and another on the table at the base of the stairs, but they didn't provide enough light to dispel the gloom or make her feel very secure. This sense of edginess, of unease, was new. Despite her isolated location, she had never worried about her safety, not once in her 2 years on the island. Then again, she had never had a visitor at night in the middle of a raging storm. But her caller was knocking, she reminded herself. People who were up to no good wouldn't announce their presence. Her concern abating, Jill walked to the door, pausing to peer through the sheer curtains that hung at the windows beside it. The visitor standing on the porch was hidden from her view, but she could see the blurred outlines of a car pulled up beside the steps. As she reached for the lock, she tried to think of some reason why anyone in their right mind would drive all the way out to her place in this kind of weather. When she couldn't come up with even one, her hand faltered. All at once the pounding started again. "Hey!" If you can hear me in there, please answer the door. A man's voice. An irritated man's voice. Jill's hands fell to her side and she took a quick step back. Perhaps she should just ignore him. If she didn't respond, he'd assume no one was home and go away, wouldn't he? Then she'd be safe. Holding her breath, she leaned closer, listening for evidence of retreat. Instead, as the silence lengthened, she heard a heavy sigh of frustration, audible even over the sounds of the storm. Look, a woman at the grocery store in East Sound said you might have a cabin I could rent for the night. The man called out. She tried to phone you, but your line is out. I really need a place to stay. This time, Jill heard the weariness in his voice. The I've had about all I can take before I fold tone. Only someone who had been there would discern it beneath the thick coating of frustration. Closing her eyes, she sent a plea heavenward. Lord, my heart tells me to help this man. He sounds like he's in need of kindness. Please keep me safe as I follow the example of the Good Samaritan. With sudden resolve, Jill tucked the flashlight under her arm and flicked back the deadbolt. But she kept the chain in place, cracking the door no more than the sturdy links would allow. Since the man on the other side was in shadows, she aimed the flashlight at his face. Muttering something she couldn't make out, he threw up his hands to deflect the intense beam of light. Could you lower that a little? Try aiming at my chest. His tone was gruff, but he sounded more relieved than angry. A flush rose on Jill's cheeks as she complied with the stranger's requests. Sorry. A couple of beats ticked by before he moved his hands aside, as if he was afraid she might pin him with the light again. Then he stared back at her with wary, watchful, cobalt blue eyes that seemed as uncertain about her as she was about him. And that was plenty uncertain, because once Jill got past his eyes, the rest of him scared her to death. Even in daylight, this man on the other side of the door would have made her nervous. His shaggy hair was damp and disheveled, and the stubble on his jaw was so thick she wondered if he was just unkempt or trying to grow a beard. A leather jacket that had logged more than his fair share of miles sat on his broad, powdered shoulders, gaping open to reveal a chest-hugging t-shirt. An alarm went off in her mind, and she reduced the crack in the door by the barest margin. But the man noticed. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment Jill was afraid he might try to force his way inside. Her grip tightened on the handle as she was prepared to slam the door if he made one wrong move. The tension emanating from the woman and the house was palpable, and Keith knew he had but a few heartbeats to put her at ease before she shut the door and left him to face the raging storm with nothing but his car for shelter. Not an appealing prospect. Not when he was this close to a real roof and dry bed. Yet he couldn't fault her caution or her alarm. Considering her remote location, she was wise to be careful with strangers, and he didn't exactly look like the boy next door. As for what she looked like, he had no idea. Although his eyes were starting to return to normal after being seared by that blinding light, all he could see through the thin crack in the door was a shadowy form. Not that her appearance mattered. The important thing was that she was his ticket to shelter, if he played his cards right. Hoping that she wasn't too spooked by his appearance to listen to his story, he snuck his hands into his pockets and took a step back, keeping his posture as non-threatening as possible. Like I said, the woman in East Sound told me there was a cabin on the property that might be available for the night. He did his best to sound conversational rather than desperate. Everything else on the island is booked because of the holiday. She tried to call, but your phone seems to be out. I could sure use a place to stay. The storm's bad. Okay, I'm going to stop here with this story. Um, Hopefully you are fast asleep, and we will pick this back up another day. Sleep well, and sleep restful, and sleep peaceful. Until again, good night.